"We'll skip your housewarming. Your brother just moved too." That was the text. No call, no explanation. Just one flat sentence from my dad that somehow carried years inside it. I stared at the screen longer than I want to admit, realizing this wasn't really about a party. It was about every moment I'd tried to be seen and somehow wasn't. What happened next didn't explode or shatter. It shifted. And in that quiet shift, I finally understood what silence, approval, and belonging really mean. It probably started on a gray Thanksgiving morning when I was 16. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted pumpkin, warm and sweet, the kind of scent that makes everything feel safe. My mom moved quickly between the stove and the counter, humming along to an old song playing softly on the radio. My dad stood near the doorway with his camcorder already recording, narrating the scene like we were actors in some perfect holiday commercial. But the camera wasn't pointed at all of us. It followed my brother Evan. He stood in the center of the kitchen, dramatically stirring batter like he was hosting his own cooking show. Every exaggerated movement earned laughter. When he cracked an egg with one hand, Dad zoomed in. When Mom called him her holiday miracle, he grinned like he'd been waiting for the line. I hovered near the counter, waiting for a pause, waiting for a small opening. When I reached for the mixing bowl to help Mom gently, took it back from my hands. "Sweetheart, let Evan handle that." Her voice wasn't sharp. It was light, casual, as if she were doing me a favor. I stepped aside and told myself it didn't matter. A few minutes later, Evan knocked over a bag of flour. It exploded across the counter in a white cloud. Instead of frustration, there was laughter. Dad captured every second, delighted. Mom brushed flour from Evan's sleeve, smiling like it was the most charming thing in the world. I grabbed a cloth and started wiping the counter before anyone asked. The flour stuck to my hands, turning them pale and ghost-like. No one noticed. They were too busy replaying the spill on the tiny camera screen. I moved to the sink washing dishes that hadn't needed washing yet. I folded napkins into careful triangles and lined up the plates so evenly they looked measured. It felt good to do something right, to be useful. But usefulness is quiet. It doesn't earn applause. At one point, I suggested a centerpiece. Something simple. Pine cones, candles, a little warmth in the middle of the table. Dad lowered the camcorder just enough to glance at me. "Don't make everything about you, Nina." His tone wasn't angry. That almost made it worse. It was calm, dismissive, as if I had broken an unspoken rule just by speaking. I swallowed whatever explanation I had ready and nodded like I understood. Like I agreed. The day moved on in that same rhythm. Evan joked about the turkey and Mom laughed too loudly. Dad filmed more than he ate. I carried dishes back and forth, refilled glasses, wiped the same clean counter twice. Before dinner, I placed a small card on the table. I had painted it the night before. Soft brush strokes, a simple quote about gratitude written in careful lettering. I'd stayed up late, waiting for the ink to dry. When everyone sat down, the card was pushed aside to make room for serving bowls. It slipped halfway under a stack of magazines, barely visible. No one mentioned it. Evan led the prayer that evening. His voice was steady and warm. At the end, he joked about being the favorite child. Laughter filled the room, easy and effortless. I laughed too, because that's what you do. Dinner passed in familiar patterns. Dad asked Evan about school. Mom brought up his soccer games. I offered to refill drinks before anyone could ask. When the plates were finally empty, I began clearing them without being told. Mom joined me briefly in the kitchen, handing me a stack of dishes. "You're such a good helper," she said with a smile. A good helper. The words were meant as praise, but they settled somewhere heavy inside me. Helper meant background. Helper meant extra. That night, after the house quieted and the leftovers were packed away, I stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the Seattle sky had turned dark and thick, the kind of gray that swallows detail. My reflection looked faint against the glass. Upstairs, Evan's guitar echoed down the hallway. I dried my hands and went to my room. From under my bed, I pulled out the small notebook I kept hidden there. The pages smelled faintly of paint and paper. It was the only place that felt fully mine. I sat cross-legged on the floor and stared at a blank page for a long time. Then I wrote one sentence. "One day they'll remember me without me asking." I didn't write it out of anger. I wrote it like a promise. Quiet, steady. If I couldn't be the center of the frame, I would become someone impossible to crop out. And for the first time that day, I felt seen, at least by myself. 4 years after that Thanksgiving, I left Seattle with one suitcase and more silence than I knew what to do with. The morning air clung to my skin, damp and familiar. My mom stood by the doorway, twisting her hands together like she wanted to say something more, but couldn't quite find the words. My dad kept his eyes on the driveway. Evan had already hugged me quick, distracted, before heading out to meet his friends. When I told them I'd received a full scholarship to study communications in California, I had imagined something different. Not fireworks, not a parade, just pride. Instead, Dad frowned. "Communications isn't stable," he said. "You're good with details. Why not accounting or law?" Mom's voice was softer, but just as heavy. "It's too far, honey. You don't know anyone there." I wanted to tell her that distance was the point, that maybe I needed space more than familiarity, that maybe I needed air, but I nodded. I always nodded. A week later, Evan announced he'd been accepted into an MBA program. The living room filled with energy I recognized too well. Dad opened a bottle of wine. Mom began planning how to help him with tuition. "We'll cover what his scholarship doesn't," she said easily. No one asked about mine. No one asked if I needed help moving, or buying textbooks, or finding a place to live. I sat there holding my acceptance letter in my lap, smiling like it didn't matter. In California, the sun was brighter than Seattle's gray, but it didn't feel warmer at first. My apartment was a tiny studio above a laundromat. The air always smelled faintly of detergent and steam. The floors creaked. The window faced a brick wall. At night, the washing machines below rumbled like distant thunder. I told myself it was comforting. At least it was noise. I worked part-time editing videos for a small creative agency that barely paid enough for groceries. Most nights, I ate instant noodles. Sometimes I cracked an egg into the pot when I could afford one, watching the yolk swirl into the broth like it was something luxurious. Hunger was easier than asking for help. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, cutting footage, adjusting sound levels, color-correcting clips for clients who never remembered my name. I'd send in drafts at 2 a.m, then wake up for classes a few hours later. It was exhausting. It was also mine. Mara changed everything without trying to. She was a film major I met during orientation, the kind of person who didn't feel silence just to avoid it. The first time we talked, we ended up sitting on the roof of our building long after sunset, sharing cheap coffee and stories about the families we'd left behind. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to fix anything. One night, after I brushed off a comment about home, she looked at me and said, "You don't have to keep earning a place in someone's life." I laughed it off at first, but she kept going. "Sometimes leaving is what saves you." Her words didn't feel dramatic. They felt steady, like sunlight slipping through fog. During my second semester, I started calling home less. When I did call, the conversations followed a pattern. Mom would ask about my classes, but only briefly. Then the topic would drift. Evan's new internship. Evan's professor who praised his presentation. Evan's networking events. "You should visit soon," Mom would say at the end of every call. No one offered to help with a plane ticket. After hanging up, I'd stare at my reflection in the dark laptop screen. I wondered if they noticed how much quieter I'd become. If they sensed the distance widening, or if they just assumed I was busy. Maybe I was. I built routines around the silence. Early mornings at the beach before class, sketching storyboards in my notebook while the tide rolled in. Late nights, editing footage under the dim glow of my desk lamp. Each project taught me something. How to frame a story so even ordinary moments looked meaningful. How to balance light so nothing important was lost in shadow. Sometimes I wondered if that's what I'd been doing my whole life, learning how to exist in the margins without disappearing. By my third year, I stopped checking the family group chat regularly. The updates were predictable: promotions, projects, weekend plans, photos of dinners I hadn't been invited to. When I sent a message, it often sat unread. It hurt less when I stopped expecting replies. Graduation arrived quietly. I stood in my cap and gown under the California sun, the fabric stiff against my shoulders. For a moment, I let myself feel it. The weight of finishing something on my own. The nights above the laundromat. The instant noodles. The edits at 2 a.m. I took a photo and sent it to the family group chat. Mom responded with a heart emoji. Dad didn't reply. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, waiting for the 3 dots to appear. They never did. That night, I sat on the floor of my studio surrounded by old sketches and empty takeout containers. The city outside hummed with a life that felt just out of reach. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. For years, I'd carried a quiet frustration at the comparisons, the indifference, the way everything seemed to orbit around someone else. But sitting there on the floor cap tossed beside me, something had shifted. The anger had thinned. In its place was something steadier. Not acceptance exactly, not forgiveness, clarity. I had spent so much of my life trying to be noticed at someone else's table. Now, for the first time, I realized I had built something without their applause. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real, and that felt like enough. By the time I turned 30, Seattle called me back. Not in some grand cinematic way. Just a small local station with peeling paint near the parking lot and a job title that sounded bigger than it paid assistant producer. The salary barely covered rent. The office coffee tasted like regret. But the first morning I walked and something in my chest settled. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to escape. I was exactly where I needed to be. The station was busy in that scrappy, understaffed way local news always is. People rushed. Scripts were rewritten at the last second. Equipment malfunctioned at the worst possible times. I stayed late almost every night, adjusting lighting setups, reorganizing shot lists, quietly fixing edits that didn't quite land. That's when Paul noticed me. He'd been a senior producer there for over 2 decades. Silver hair, worn leather jacket, the kind of presence that didn't need volume to command a room. One evening, as I was fine-tuning a segment, everyone else had gone home. To forget, he leaned against the doorway and watched for a minute. "You've got the eye, Nina," he said. "Don't waste it polishing other people's work." It wasn't praise, it was permission. Under Paul's guidance, I started to understand storytelling in a different way. Not just angles and transitions, but rhythm, where a pause could say more than narration. How ordinary rooms held quiet histories if you let the camera linger long enough. After months behind the scenes, I pitched an idea. It was small, almost forgettable. A local feature about coastal houses around Puget Sound and the people who lived in them. Not celebrity homes, not glossy interiors, just real spaces with stories etched into their walls. I called it Homes of the Sound. The station approved it as filler content, something to run between bigger programs. The first episode aired with little fanfare, but then letters started arriving. Viewers sent photos of their grandparents' houses. They wrote about docks that had seen generations grow up, about kitchens that had held grief and laughter in equal measure. Within 6 months, the little filler segment became the most watched program in its slot. I remember standing in the control room one night, watching the numbers come in, feeling something shift inside me. For so long, I had been adjusting myself to fit into other people's frames. Now I was building my own. When Paul retired, he didn't give a speech. He simply handed me his old director's chair. "You know what to do," he said. I held that chair longer than necessary after he left, tracing the worn wood along the armrest. It felt like inheritance, not of status, of trust. With savings scraped together and a small grant from the station, I founded my own production company, Northlight Media. At first, it was just me and 3 freelancers working out of a borrowed office space. We edited between coffee refills and looming deadlines. The carpet was outdated, the equipment was secondhand, but the stories were ours. We focused on documentaries about architecture and craftsmanship, the people behind the spaces, the quiet builders, the designers who never made magazine covers but shaped the way others lived. There were no big investors, no flashy marketing campaigns, just real stories. The company grew faster than I expected. Word spread. Viewers responded. 2 years in, Northlight Media won a regional award for visual storytelling. I stood on stage under warm lights, hearing my name, followed by applause that didn't fade too quickly. It felt strange, not overwhelming, not surreal, just right. For once I wasn't invisible. Soon after, an email arrived from Bravo. They wanted me to direct a national series titled Open Homes USA. I read the contract twice, the way I used to reread my father's messages. Only this time the words didn't sting. They opened doors. The budget was massive compared to anything I'd handled before. The schedule relentless. We traveled coast to coast, filming designers, dreamers, homeowners who had poured their souls into spaces no one else would understand. Every shoot felt like reclaiming something. Every episode felt like proof. The show became a hit, syndicated across multiple platforms. My inbox filled with offers I once would have assumed were meant for someone else. Meetings in glass offices, invitations to speak, opportunities that used to live only in the corners of my imagination. But the most important shift wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped asking whether I deserved to be there. When the final episode aired, I made a decision that surprised even me. I bought a villa in Queen Anne. A hilltop mansion overlooking the bay, sunlight spilling across glass walls each morning. $12 million worth of space and air and quiet proof. It wasn't about luxury, it was about evidence. Every sleepless night above the laundromat, every bowl of instant noodles, every time I let a call go unanswered, they were all here, transformed into marble floors and oak beams and wide open windows. I designed the interior myself. Clean lines, warm wood, a long oak dining table positioned to catch the coastal light just before sunset. Part of the house became a studio for my next project, a creative space for new artists who reminded me of the girl I used to be. Talented, quiet, waiting for permission that would never come. As the final touches were made, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a letter, an invitation. I invited Mom, Dad, Evan. I imagined them walking through the marble foyer, hearing their footsteps echo across the floors, seeing the life I had built without their applause. Not to prove anything, just to show them. That night, as I stood in the villa, surrounded by carefully placed candles and table settings, arranged exactly as I'd envisioned, my phone lit up. A message from Dad. I opened it slowly. "We'll skip your housewarming. Your brother just moved too." That was it. No congratulations, no apology, no explanation. Just a familiar shift of attention. I read it twice. The words felt almost practiced in their casualness, like they had always been waiting for a moment like this. I typed my reply carefully. "That's okay, Dad." I placed the phone face down on the long oak table, the one I had designed myself, and looked around at the house. Every wall held the echo of the years it took to build it. The silence inside wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, and for the first time in my life, I realized I had built something they could decline, but never diminish. The morning after my father's message, the house felt too large. The oak table stretched across the dining room like a question no one had answered. I had imagined my parents sitting at one end, Evan somewhere near the window, sunlight catching in his glass. I had planned the music, the lighting, even the way the front door would open, so the first impression felt warm. Now the silence pressed against the walls. For a few hours I let myself sit with it. The ache wasn't sharp anymore. It was dull, familiar. And then something shifted. If they wouldn't come, the table didn't have to stay empty. I pulled out a notepad and started writing names. Not the obvious ones, not the impressive ones. The cameraman who once stayed 2 hours past wrapped to help me fix a broken light on my first independent shoot. He never mentioned it again, just packed up and left like it was nothing. My neighbor from years ago who had knocked on my door with soup when she noticed delivery boxes piling up outside and guessed I was too busy or too tired to cook. The high school teacher who told me to keep painting even when my grades suggested I should focus on something practical. And Aunt Lorraine, the only one who had always remembered to ask how I was, not what I had accomplished. With each name, the list felt less like a guest roster and more like a repair. I called a local chef, Margaret. She arrived that afternoon with quiet confidence, her handshake firm but unshowy. No dramatic introductions, no visible awe at the house. As we discussed the menu, she paused and looked up. "Who's the dinner for?" I didn't hesitate. For people who were never invited. She didn't smile in pity or ask for explanation. She simply nodded. "Then we'll make it something worth remembering." We planned a meal that felt honest. Salmon, roasted vegetables, a pear tart for dessert. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress. just food that carried warmth instead of spectacle. When the evening came, there was no red carpet, no camera crew, just the sound of shoes at the door and small surprised smiles as each guest stepped inside. They didn't know they were filling someone else's absence. They just knew they had been asked. I greeted each one by name. And for the first time in years, I wasn't presenting anything. I wasn't proving anything. I was simply welcoming. The conversations unfolded naturally. No speeches, no formal toasts. People leaned toward one another, sharing stories about projects that almost failed, chances they hadn't taken, small wins. No one had applauded. Laughter rose and settled without performance. At one point, I stood near the edge of the room and just listened. Really listened. The hum of voices, the clink of glasses, the soft scrape of chairs being pulled closer. Lorraine leaned toward me and whispered, "You made something good out of nothing, sweetheart." But it wasn't nothing. It was presence. When dessert was served, no one rushed. No one checked their phone. Each seat at the table was occupied. Each plate held proof that someone belonged there, even if only for a few hours. After they left, I ran my hand along the smooth wood of the table. Every chair had been used. The next night the crew arrived. Cables, cameras, quiet anticipation. They had come to film the opening scene for the new series. The long table stood ready again, not staged, but lived in. Margaret moved through the kitchen with calm precision, plating dishes as if it were any other shoot. But something felt different. The room still carried the echo of the night before. When the guests returned, the same ones, the atmosphere shifted in a way the crew hadn't expected. There were no rehearsed lines, no dramatic entrances, just conversation. As the cameras rolled, people spoke the way they had the previous evening, softly, honestly, without angling themselves toward the lens. No one performed gratitude. No one competed for attention. I noticed a few members of the crew exchange glances. This wasn't the usual energy of television. During a pause in filming, a young reporter approached me. She held her notebook tightly, like she was afraid to ask the wrong thing. "What inspired this?" she asked. I didn't search for a polished answer. "Fairness isn't decoration," I said. "It's design." She blinked once, then wrote it down carefully. Around us, guests leaned toward one another, listening fully. No interruptions. No one trying to dominate the conversation. The balance felt intentional, but not forced. At one point, the cameraman, an older man with silver hair, lowered his camera and simply watched. Later, he told me quietly, "You don't see this often. People just being." The crew kept the setup simple. No filters, no retakes. The lights were soft enough to see every line on every face. As the evening continued, I noticed something small and beautiful. No one looked down. No one shrank. There was no invisible center pulling attention toward one person. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When the director finally signaled cut, no one moved immediately. The guests stayed seated mid-conversation as if stepping away too quickly might break whatever had formed. For years, I had built images of belonging, framed them, edited them, polished them until they looked convincing. But that night, I wasn't constructing anything. I wasn't waiting to be noticed. I was inside it, and for the first time in my life, belonging didn't feel like something I had to earn. It felt like something I had built and was finally allowed to sit in. The episode aired on a rainy Seattle morning. I hadn't planned to watch it live. I told myself I didn't need to. But the sound of thunder rolling somewhere beyond the bay made the house feel smaller, more intimate. So I let it play. The opening scene was quieter than most television. No dramatic music, no sweeping introduction. Just the long oak table and the low hum of conversation. People leaning in, listening. Before the credits finished, my phone began to vibrate. One message, then 5, then 20. Colleagues, old classmates, numbers I didn't recognize. A few I had deleted years ago. Beautiful work. Thank you for saying what no one says. That felt different. Each message was short, almost careful. But together they built something steady like waves, brushing against a shore I hadn't visited in a long time. By mid-morning, Aunt Lorraine called. Her voice carried the same warmth it always had. "You did good, sweetheart," she said. "They're facing what you carried for years." I didn't respond right away. I stood by the window watching rain streak down the glass, letting her words settle. There was no bitterness in her tone, no victory, just recognition. Later that day, I learned that one of Mom's neighbors had called her excited. "I just saw your daughter on TV. What a wonderful project." Apparently, the conversation hadn't gone the way Mom expected. For hours, she said nothing publicly. Then, sometime in the afternoon, she posted a photo from the episode on her social media. So proud, the caption read. It spread quickly, not because of celebration, but because of timing. The comments underneath were polite, but pointed. "Didn't you say she moved away years ago? Wasn't she the one who left home?" It wasn't cruel, just curious, the kind of quiet scrutiny that doesn't need sharp edges to cut. I stared at the post longer than I thought I would. I tried to feel anger or satisfaction. Instead, I felt something quieter, distance. Evan stayed silent for 2 days. Then someone from his office commented publicly, asking why he hadn't been at the dinner. His response was vague travel scheduling conflicts, the kind of answer that fills space without explaining anything. A few of his friends reposted clips of me speaking about belonging. One added, "Ouch." Another wrote, "That must have hurt." After that, he stopped responding entirely. Dad called 6 times that week. Each time my phone lit up, my chest tightened, not with panic, not even with anger. More like the faint pressure of an old bruise being pressed gently. I let every call go to voicemail. On the 7th call, I waited until the rain had slowed before listening. His voice was different. Not authoritative, not dismissive. "I saw you," he began. A pause. I could hear him breathing. "You've done something good." Another pause, longer this time. I'm proud." Nah. He stopped there like he had run out of words. I listened to the message twice. Those were the words I had once imagined hearing at 16. The ones I had tried to earn with folded napkins and perfect grades and silent obedience. They had arrived too late to define me, but not too late to soften something. I didn't call him back. Not out of punishment, just because I didn't need to. The emails from viewers kept coming. A teacher from Ohio wrote that she had shown the episode to her class to start a discussion about fairness, about who gets centered in stories and who doesn't. A retired architect shared that the dinner reminded him of a community table his late wife used to host, where neighbors gathered without invitation lists or expectations. A mother said her teenage daughter had watched the episode and decided to invite a quiet classmate to lunch the next day. I didn't realize how much she felt unseen, she wrote. Your show helped me notice. I read every message slowly. Some were long and detailed. Others were only a few lines. but each one carried the same thread. They hadn't just watched something, they had recognized something. By evening, the rain hadn't stopped. Seattle blurred into silver and gray beyond the windows. I stood there with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, thinking about Mom behind her screen, about Evan avoiding questions, about Dad replaying his own words. It didn't feel like victory. There was no swelling music, no cinematic closure. It felt like weather. Unpredictable, cleansing, necessary. Lorraine texted me again that night. "Some storms don't destroy," she wrote. "They reveal." I smiled at that. The applause, the praise, the public acknowledgement, they didn't change who I was. They didn't fill the spaces that had shaped me, but they did something else. They proved that what I had built at that table, quiet fairness, unforced belonging, had reached beyond that room. And as for my father's voicemail, I saved it, not as a trophy, just as a reminder. Sometimes the words we wait our whole lives to hear don't arrive when we need them. But when they finally do, they can still land gently. And sometimes that's enough. By the time Nina left Seattle for Portland, the noise had already quieted. The episode had aired. The calls had come. The voicemail from her father, his voice thick, deliberate, saying he was proud, still sat saved in her phone. She had listened to it twice. The first time with her eyes closed. The second time standing at the kitchen counter. Sunlight falling across the marble she had once believed would finally prove something. It hadn't. The pride had arrived. The recognition had arrived. Even her mother's public post had arrived. But none of it rearranged her life. What changed her life was something else. Evan's email came 3 days after the broadcast. It was long, measured, careful. He wrote about being misunderstood, about how families grow through conflict, about how he hoped they could reset. He congratulated her on the show's success. He mentioned a potential expansion in his firm's West Coast operations. He ended with, "We should talk. We've both changed." Nina read it once. She did not draft a response. She did not forward it to Mara or Paul or Aunt Lorraine. She did not dissect the tone or wonder what he meant between the lines. She simply closed her laptop, reopened it, and pressed delete. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Distance, she had learned, did not have to be dramatic to be decisive. When Bravo confirmed the second season of Open Homes USA, they asked what direction she wanted to take. The first season had focused on families redesigning physical space. The network suggested leaning into bigger budgets, larger properties, more spectacle. Nina surprised herself by saying no. "I want to stay with belonging," she said, but without permission. The executive paused. Without permission. Yes, no one waiting for approval. No one proving themselves. Just people building spaces that reflect who they already are. It felt like speaking a private truth aloud. Season 2 would center on chosen family friends, renovating together widows, creating shared housing, adult siblings who had rebuilt trust. The through line wasn't architecture, it was agency. And for the first time, Nina did not wonder how her parents would interpret it. She did not imagine Evan's critique. She did not frame the concept as rebuttal. It was simply the work she wanted to make. Portland offered a softer skyline, fewer glass towers, more trees. The house she rented first sat near the river. Nothing like the Queen Anne villa. Nothing she would have once considered aspirational. Wide windows, weathered wood floors, a narrow back deck that looked out over moving water. In the mornings, mist rose off the surface like breath. She walked along the river path most evenings after editing sessions. No headphones, no calls. The quiet there felt different from the silence she had known growing up. That silence had been full of withheld words of swallowed disappointment. This one was open, protective. Her mother texted occasionally. Polite updates, photographs from church gatherings, links to articles about Nina's show always framed with "so proud of you." Nina responded, kindly, briefly. She no longer searched for subtext. Her father called less often now. When he did, he asked about logistics, filming schedules, travel dates, whether Portland traffic was as bad as Seattle's. The conversations were careful, but gentler than before. Something in him had shifted after that voicemail. Or perhaps something in her had. Evan did not write again, and she did not check. Work filled her days, but not the way it used to. There was no frantic edge, no late-night drive to prove. She delegated more. She trusted her crew. She let scenes breathe instead of tightening them for maximum effect. Belonging, she had realized, could not be edited into existence. It had to be lived. On the river path one evening, Mara called from California, laughing about a disastrous shoot and a broken light rig. They talked about nothing consequential. Recipes, weather, the absurdity of fame. "You sound lighter," Mara said. "I am," Nina answered. It was true. The tightness she once carried in her shoulders, the constant bracing, had dissolved so gradually she hadn't noticed when it left. Peace, she understood now, was not reconciliation. Reconciliation required mutual reckoning, required apology and repair. What she had instead was release. She no longer needed her parents to understand the years they hadn't shown up. She no longer needed Evan to admit imbalance. Their late pride did not erase the past. It did not rewrite it, but it also did not control her future. Silence became a boundary. She chose rather than endured. She did not announce it. She did not weaponize it. She simply allowed conversations to end where they ended. The river kept moving whether anyone praised it or not. On the first day of filming for season 2, she stood behind the monitor, watching a pair of lifelong friends measure a kitchen island they planned to build together. They argued gently over countertop materials. They laughed easily. No one in the room seemed to be auditioning for love. Nina felt a quiet recognition. This is what fairness looks like, she thought. Not equal applause, equal presence. Later that night, back in her rented house, she sat at the small wooden table by the window. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. She ate takeout from compostable containers and watched the sky fade into indigo over the water. Her phone buzzed once, a production update. Nothing urgent. She thought of the long arc that had brought her here. The studio above a laundromat, the tiny Seattle station, Paul's steady mentorship, the first episode of Homes of the Sound, the Queen Anne housewarming filled with chosen family. The rainy morning, the world responded. The voicemail that healed something small but important. Each chapter had felt at the time like a test. Now they felt like steps. She had spent so many years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never set for her. Somewhere along the way, she stopped knocking. She built her own. And the remarkable thing, the thing she only now fully grasped, was that she no longer measured her worth by who refused to sit at it. The river moved steadily in the dark. So did she. If you've ever had to protect your peace, even from family, you're not alone. Sometimes love and distance exist in the same breath. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever chosen quiet over conflict? Share in the comments if you feel comfortable. And if stories about boundaries, healing, and self-worth speak to you, you're welcome to stay a while. In the end, the bravest thing we build might simply be our own peace.